This conference will now be recorded.
And of course, as always, if there's any connection challenges, please let me know by putting a note in the chat. I discovered that my spouse, who is working by webinar himself in another area of the house, we often have dueling webinars. I, however, have relocated as close as possible to the Wi-Fi connection, so I believe I will be stealing all the bandwidth. So that's how it rolls in our house. Well, thank you again for those of you joining live, and for those of you watching. I think a few people have participated in several of these conversations. Thank you for coming back. For those of you joining or listening for the first time, I hope you find this an interesting, valuable discussion. I probably have spent the weekend relaxing, enjoying. It was a holiday weekend. It was great. The weather in Chicago, where I am, was quite lovely. But I was also thinking just a lot about this topic and how to introduce it, especially at this time. I mean, there's so many things that we can be discussing. So I'm going to try to keep it a bit balanced based on my personal experience dealing with the topic of resilience, and then how I both research, teach, and then build the topic of resilience into my coaching work, because it's something that I have, just for a variety of reasons, had several of occasions to really dig deep in, and hope to share some of those insights with all of you. As we get started, again, just a few logistics. Again, many of you I've had a chance to speak with before. My name is Pam Schilling, and I run Archer Career as our Chief Executive Officer and thought leader in the career space. I have an amazing, talented team that's even growing. We have a couple of interns who've joined us for the summer, which I'm really excited about, but just a totally committed group of people that care a lot about careers and career advancement, and really getting, the most out of both educational investments and also the hard work that we put into our careers. And a couple of other logistics as we get started. This webinar series, I imagine we're going to continue like this over the next several months. I'm super excited. I had a little bit of a shift in my schedule, but I'm very excited about the next session that I'm going to be doing on June 9th. I actually have a colleague of mine who has just gone through an interview process, and she's going to join me for a conversation and talking a little bit about her longer term preparation, talking about how that interview came about, what led up to it, how she prepared. And I think it's just going to be a great discussion, dialogue. Many of you are job searching in her shoes, and I just think it'll be a nice conversation to kind of hear from somebody who's walking in the trenches right now. So that'll be on June 9th. And then for a couple of weeks, I do a lot of work with individuals that are looking at consulting jobs or jobs that use consulting skill sets, whether it's product management, project management, some of the data science roles, some brand management, corporate strategy, other type of business competencies. We're going to do a couple of sessions each month over the course of the summer to drill down on that area a lot. I just have a lot of individuals that are interested in that. We're going to talk about the consulting industry and kind of this broad why consulting, talk a little bit about why it's so hard to get these type of jobs. And then we're also going to do a session that introduces the case interview and talk a little bit about that, just as a way to introduce it for those that are maybe thinking about going into consulting, for those who may find in your interview process you end up with a case interview, and have some discussion about that and how to prepare for it. I know that I work with a lot of professionals that almost get surprised by case interviews and not interviewing for consulting jobs. So that's why we want to put that on the agenda for these webinars. So those are coming up. And then again, I continue to do some individual coaching This is one of the highlights of my week as well, just getting a chance to talk to so many different individuals that have career questions. And I continue to donate those fees to a local business here in my community. And that's just something I'm really excited about. Our team is, very focused on contributing to the success of others, and small businesses continue to struggle in our environment. So it's our way of helping in that context. With that, our focus then for this conversation, resilience. I'm going to talk about a few things. One, to discuss the characteristics of people who are resilient, and in some ways, why this is hard. It is not something that I have always done extremely well. I would say at times in my own professional and personal journey, it was something I did not do well. And even today, where I think that I have built more of this skill set, I have moments where, quite frankly, I think I'll describe it as fallen off the wagon. And I know when that happens now. That's probably the difference between the professional that I am today and my younger self. And one of the reasons why I became very, I guess, interested in the topic of resilience, well, really, there's two reasons. So one, I started teaching and working with college students, and I would imagine that we have a few students in college joining us tonight and who will be listening to this. I saw a lot of challenges with some of my college students that had nothing to do with the course topic. It just had to do with kind of working through the everyday stressors. And I was compelled to want to understand the drivers behind those challenges. And so I started doing research in this area. And then I think the other factor is I became a parent, and I started thinking about how I would need to teach and guide my own kids. And if I was going to do that and, try to do it halfway right, I just wanted to understand this topic. And then it filtered into so many other aspects of my work with my clients. For any of you doing a job search or having done job searches in the past, I can imagine this statement is obvious, but it is a roller coaster. And sometimes when you're job searching for a very long period of time, it's hard to kind of stay motivated. And so that's, a big part of my work as well. And then even if we're not job searching, just staying in our jobs and staying motivated and trying to tackle organizational politics, if we're working with clients in some way, dealing with their idiosyncrasies, and this concept of trying to stick to it, but yet being in the moment while still looking forward to our goals and ambitions. I mean, I think this is a struggle for many, many professionals. And I don't care what your background, what your education, what your job, what your age is. I think it touches everybody. So we're going to talk on this topic, and I'm going to lay out what research tells us about the components to having resilience. I call this the resilience framework. And then I'm going to offer a few suggestions on how to continue to build your resilience, how maybe to start building it if it's something that maybe is a definite struggle. And I think also for many of us right now, resilience has taken on a different definition because we have many, many more constraints. We might be feeling like progress is not happening. And the time horizon is so uncertain that having some extra tools to kind of dig in might be helpful. And as always, I'll take a few pauses for questions via the chat and then live to hear a little bit from some of the things that all of you are thinking about. So I could probably give you all dozens of examples of, in my own life, I guess, facing obstacles and where I've had to dig in. there's so many examples, it's even hard to think about it. But I think, I'll maybe give two as a bit of context, just so that we can all relate on this topic together. So I'm going to go way back for a moment, way, way back. As a college student, I was an accounting major. I was a very good student, and most of the people in my program landed jobs in public accounting. So back then, there were 8 major accounting firms. That tells you a little bit of my age. And the top accounting students, it was almost automatic to get jobs at one of those firms. Places like Deloitte, places like Price Waterhouse, Coopers and Lybrand, at the time, Arthur Andersen. These were the elite of the elite jobs if you were an accounting major. And most of my friends and I assumed that we would land ourselves in those jobs at my university. And like, many of the college recruiting processes today, all those firms came to our campus. They came within 2 or 3 weeks of each other. And very quickly into the fall of my senior year of college, I found myself as the last person standing, and that was without a job. In spite of being highly recruited by all of those firms, I somehow came out of that process and did not have a job offer. Not only did I not have a job offer from the elite accounting firms, I didn't have a job offer from the boutique firms. Probably it was me. There was clearly something that I was not doing right, but you have to kind of stand up and pick up yourself. Now, I found myself in a reasonably fortunate position because I chose to interview also with some companies, and those were my backup plans. And I happened to land a very good job offer with what ended up being my first job out of college, Sprint, where I worked for 7.5 years. So there was definitely a silver lining. There was a lot of heartbreak for a very short period of time. And, I think I had no other choice than to just keep pursuing, some type of a job and do so without hesitation. If you want to know the truth behind the accounting job, at some level I found out it wasn't me per se. I had a job offer coming, and I found this later from one of the professionals at one of the firms, and my job offer got pulled because of a comment by one of my professors, who apparently did not think I was particularly well suited for accounting. And frankly, that guy did me a huge favor because I was not. But for the longest time, I mean years, I ruminated on this, and it fueled me probably in a slightly negative way, meaning I'll show them. And I thought about it and I turned it over in my head, and it made me very competitive as a young adult. And I think what I didn't understand at the time was that I probably could have channeled that in another way. But this was my form of dealing with it and moving on. Later down the road, you find yourself trying to learn from those early career experiences. And, I found myself in jobs where it wasn't necessarily going well. My last consulting job that I had, it was not a great fit. The path, I was in a position to be moving to the path to partner. It probably wasn't going to happen. And in consulting, some of the firms, there's an up or out. And if you don't go out on your own, they ask you to go out. And I could kind of see that writing on the wall. Just again, it wasn't a great fit. I didn't have an internal sponsor. And I just decided to leave. And I had no job, and I took a sabbatical, and I sat myself down and asked, what am I going to do next? And I spent 3 or 4 months unemployed, no emails, no plan, trying to figure it out. Right? Well, I don't think I'm alone. And certainly these are not the end of the world scenarios. but it's how you deal with those circumstances. And I try to understand a little bit of, why I was wired this way. I don't have all the answers other than a few things that probably occurred in my life when I was a kid. Some of it was the mentors around me. But when I started doing my research on resilience, I think I understood that probably I was engaging in some of the activities and I didn't really know it. So, that was just dumb luck. Well, I don't like dumb luck. I'd rather be a little bit planful about it. And then, by the way, these types of professional setbacks and obstacles, we are not unique. And some of the most wildly successful people have had enormous amounts of setbacks. And one of the challenges, by the way, I think not only in the environment that we're in because of our health crisis, but just in general where we are in 2020, and some of it comes from the information on social media, we tend to see a lot of the rosy, what happens is we see people in their best self. We see the pictures, we hear people talking about things, we look for likes, and it's all very glowing and very rosy. And it's hard sometimes to see all the struggles that people face. And I am a bit of a business historian. I like to look at biographies of leaders and entrepreneurs. I like to look at the histories of companies. And when I did some research on this a few years back, some really prominent things stood out to me about individuals who had very significant failures and then worked through them in a super resilient way. So the first one that I found, and it was a little bit close to home because of my background, was Alexander Graham Bell. He was the inventor of the telephone. And many, many, many years ago, he had a patent on the telephone. He tried to sell it to a company called Western Union, and they more or less told him to pound sand. And Alexander Graham Bell persisted. He more or less formed the company, which became AT&T, and he invented the digital communications environment. And this is back in the 1800s, but people did not believe his idea. I think another super famous example that many of us are familiar with is Steve Jobs. And you may know from some of his career history, at a certain point, he was fired from Apple, the company that he created. And he did some things in that time, and then he came back to Apple. And as a result, we had things emerge like iPods, iPhones, iPads, Macs, the equipment, all the equipment that's sitting on my desk right now, frankly. But to think about that and to be the entrepreneur that you've created this thing and you essentially get pushed out of your own company, I mean, that's pretty epic. Steve's as we know, a bit of a crazy person, but again, we're thinking about some of the characteristics. And then another example that I'm very intimately involved with right now because of my kids is the author J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter series. And if you know much about her, she had her book idea. It was rejected, not once, but 12 times. And she did finally sell the rights to the first book for some ridiculous amount of money. But eventually, as we know, the books took off. And I think the Harry Potter empire was last valued at $25 billion, something like that. So the theme that keeps coming through when you read the history of these individuals, when I think about my own history and you hear some of their quotes and some of the things that they've said is, everybody has setbacks, and the degrees of those setbacks are from small to enormous, but you work your way through it. And that confidence is important. And when you get through it, you're better and wiser on the other side. And I know personally that that is something that I have appreciated about my own experiences. And in the moment when I wasn't offered a job, when a client fired me, I've had that happen a couple of times, when my business seemed to slow down, when an organization and I didn't click, all of these things in that moment seem really dark. Um, and that darkness is hard to work its way through. And by the way, I want to separate some of this from many of the challenges that individuals have with mental health and disorders that require medical care and those type of things, because those have a deeper issue that has to be dealt with, that there needs to be a bigger team involved. I'm speaking about the types of challenges that we can work through on our own. But I think also part of this process is having that self-awareness to know when you're on that line, and how to work through these things in the appropriate way. So with some of that said, from the research that I've done and thinking about this and working with this topic over many years, what we find is that resilient people have three main characteristics. So one is a true acceptance of reality. And you will find me having conversations with, whether it's, my friends, my family, myself, it's like, this situation really sucks. I might even use stronger language depending on who's in the room. I might get really angry. I might recognize that the situation is not fair. I have been known to throw things into bodies of water to deal with my pent up frustration, but that is the reality and we just accept it. I think the second characteristic, though, is that there is a deeper understanding that there's this bigger meaning out there for you and your role and what life has to offer. And that is something that is, I think, incredibly important. I read this when my kids were much younger because, again, I was trying to think about some of these things in their context, but it really made sense when I extrapolated it. They talk about when you understand your family and your family history and your family heritage, that it really helps with that meaning. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not great, but having it held up that way gives you a stronger sense of where you stand and having goals and some of these, things that we look forward to in the future. But the key is having a deep belief that you are part of that equation. And then the third element is this ability to improvise. And for sure right now, this is something that tons of people are having to do daily. I'm down in the basement of my house. I do not normally do webinars in the basement of my house. I should clean up my basement. That would be even better. The way that we're working, the career paths that we're thinking about, the job opportunities that we're looking at, the investments that we might choose to make in education, the things that we might not do. People who are resilient have a better ability to do that improvisation. I told you guys about my accounting career path. I never became an accountant. I was never a CPA. And I have no regrets about that. I went down a different path that was super meaningful, super fulfilling. It was definitely not in the game plan, but I can't go back and I can't change the wheels of time, but I had to improvise my career goals and expectations. Even today, for me, being a career coach was never on the career path. I mean, if you look at all the things that I'd ever written down about my goals and my interests, this was by no means what I thought I was going to do. And even when I did this, the first, 4 or 5 months, I thought it was a working career sabbatical. And that was 12 years ago. So my career today is a complete improvisation from where I thought I was going to be when I went to business school, which was a chief financial officer. Couldn't be two different things. The research tells us that you can bounce back, but you got to have these ingredients. And that's something that I think is worth understanding. And it's also worth some valuable self-assessment. I have a son who frankly is not great at improvising. He's very focused. I mean, granted, he's little, so I don't think this is some assessment of his future. But I look at that and I think about it, and it causes me to challenge him at times to create a little bit of that improvisation, because not all of us are super great at that, as an example. Another aspect of this characteristic of resilience is that we see below the surface, right? So a lot of times we see what the tip of the iceberg is. We see the posts on, whatever your favorite social media might be. We see people acknowledging their accomplishments. You might be walking, formally the halls of a university environment, and you see people's accolades. You see the outcomes. A lot of times what we don't see is what's below the surface of the water, and how hard it was to get those outcomes or those accolades. Or frankly, you're the person that people see as super successful, and they don't necessarily know how hard you worked. The simple analogy here as well is, if you look at, like a duck swimming on a lake, you see the duck, more or less very gently, elegantly, moving across the lake. What you don't see is their feet moving, like crazy under the water. And that is something that helps in this regard, because we all know that in order to get things done, there's often a lot of hard work. There's definitely risk sometimes. You're staying up late, you're studying, you're working on a project, you're thinking about an idea. There's setbacks, there are even failures. There's lots of actions and decisions that you're taking. All of these things go on, and we don't often talk about them. Many times when we get together with, friends or colleagues, we are hearing the revisionist history story. Maybe some of the facts have been stripped away. And I know this to be the case because when I'm doing interview prep with people, it's oftentimes hard to come up with a failure story, or it's hard to get into the details for certain setbacks. And I think just as humans, our nature is to think more about the good stuff and put away the stuff that's kind of painful. But what it means is it can be hard to put up your resilience shields when sometimes you feel like you're facing frustration, challenges, setbacks, and you see people around you that are having all kinds of success. It makes you feel like you're not doing something right. The truth is that those folks maybe had all those things that are below the surface of the water. You just may not see all of that. So these are some of the things that help with our perspective. Again, research, and I think this is the good news, and this is why I speak on this topic. I've actually taught semester-long classes. This is one of the lectures I give when I travel each year. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to do it this year, so fingers crossed for next year. But I do this because the research tells us that resilience, it's not in our DNA. If you guys do a personality test, the 5 personality factors, personality is much more fixed, and it's hard to change over time. and through skill building. But resilience is a skill set, and that is the good news. That's one of the things that is what draws our attention for this topic. You can learn how to do these things, but it takes a conscientious effort and to make sure that you've got reinforcing mechanisms to be able to do so and get feedback. With that, let's talk about that framework then. There, again, based on the research, there are 4 components to resilience. Some of these are possibly obvious. It's what is behind them that I think is so interesting and fascinating. And that's what I'm just going to walk through for a couple of minutes. So the 4 components of resilience, one is problem solving. That possibly is the most obvious. The second is social competence. I'll dive into that and define it a little bit more in a second. The third in the lower right is our purpose and beliefs. That kind of gets to that, knowing that there's meaning in life and having that connection. And the fourth area down in the lower left is self-leadership, which is how you guide you, not leading others. So there are many facets to leadership, and resilience really probes on how you lead yourself as an individual. Let me then talk through the elements of each of these, because they have different kind of activities, behaviors, actions that you can take to build the competency within each of these components. The first is problem solving. And there's a couple of things here that I'm going to highlight. And when I talk a little bit about next steps, I'll go into them a little bit more. So the types of activities or actions that people take for problem solving, they focus on a few things. So one is planning. And when I say planning, I don't mean having plans. I mean having some of the tasks that allow you to achieve the plan. There is something comforting in having a plan. What it can do when you face challenges is you can go to the plan and you can figure out if you're working the plan or if you're off the plan, or are there things that you've forgotten that you hadn't built in the plan, and then you can add them to the plan. But it enables us to break large things down that may have longer term horizons into smaller chunks. We don't want to have to bite off these big elements because it can be hard to feel a sense of progress. The second activity, and this is probably the one, if I had to highlight any of these, that I think is very impactful but yet not often used, is scenario development. So scenarios are thinking through alternative outcomes, good outcomes, bad outcomes, worst case scenarios. They really help us. And so when we're trying to work our way through a problem, we're trying to make a decision, the idea is to think through different scenarios and say, what if? What if that scenario comes true? What if I lose my job? What if I get furloughed? What if I get laid off? What if I'm a student and I don't have an internship this summer? What if? What is that? What are 4 or 5 possible outcomes of that scenario? And what that results in a lot of times to help us in terms of resilience is to realize that perhaps the worst case scenario isn't as bad as we might think. That's one. Secondly, if the worst case scenario is really, really bad, then we go back to planning and we try to figure out how to work our way not to have the worst case scenario come to be. All right, and I'm gonna come back to this topic a little bit more in my sort of next steps. The other thing about problem solving is help seeking. Who is it that you can involve to help you? So are there people Are there professors? Are there mentors? Are there colleagues? Are there family members? Are there things online? Um, there's lots of financial questions that come up, I think, especially in environments like this. What are the different places where you can go to get help? But the help seeking, the most important aspect of it is being willing to ask for help. And I will tell you guys, I used to be terrible at asking for help. I like to do things. I like to carry the weight on my shoulders. I think sometimes it's just easier to do it to myself. I have all those, kind of hang-ups, if you will. And if you ask for help, it's a sign of weakness. And I wasn't raised to be weak. I was raised to be strong, right? That's some of my family history. My help seeking went into hyperdrive first when my twin sons were born. And there is just a reality that two people with two, crying babies, sometimes you need help. And a lot of people told me to ask for help. And then they said, really, we mean it. And so I was very fortunate in that regard, but it was encouraged a lot. And I worked my way through it. But the second time I had to ask for a lot of help, and this was probably another one of my resilience experiences. About 2.5 years ago, I broke my ankle. Now that seems, whatever, it's an annoyance. It was my, right foot, so I couldn't drive. That was just a bummer. And it was very inconvenient for sure. And I had to have surgery on it, which is a little bit, more involved. Okay, it's just a broken ankle. However, about a week after I broke my ankle, my husband was actually in a car accident and found himself, fairly severely injured, had a spinal injury. Fortunately, no long-term consequences. But I tell you guys this because now we were completely shut down with two kids in preschool. And if you've ever, felt like you needed desperate help, that was a moment where I couldn't even cook meals for my family. And that was it was a very interesting journey. Again, everybody was fine. Certainly, the health crisis passed once we got through the broken bones and surgeries. But I had to have people drive me places. I had to have people bring us food. I had to have people walk our dog. I mean, this is like, in some ways, it's just hard to ask for that kind of help, but you have to. So, I don't ask for help lightly, but I think when there are times that you need to ask for it, you need to ask for it, and people understand it. So all those things go into problem solving. I'm in this situation. What do I need to do to keep moving forward and to sustain all of the basics along with get me where I'm going? And then on top of it, you have to apply critical thinking and you have to be creative. I mean, that's just a part of problem solving. If this isn't working, you have a choice. You either stick to it and just see if time heals or helps, or maybe try another way. And that's part of both critical thinking and being creative. If it's not working, more and more of doing the same may not make it work. And I think, in the environment right now, this is one of the aspects that people really are thinking about and trying to be creative. If the job's not there, is there part-time work? If you can do contract work, can you do additional online education that is helpful but not costly? If plan A doesn't work, what's plan B, C, and D? These are the ways that we have to think creatively. And sometimes the help seeking is getting other people to help you think through that path, right? So these are some of the normal things that I think we consider as part of resilience. The piece that, again, I highlight is just this scenario planning, running through all the potential scenarios and challenging yourself to think through the worst case scenarios and to ask, is that if that happened, what's the consequence of it? And then what do I have to do to try to avoid the worst case scenario? The next area I want to speak about then is social competence. Normally, this would be a little bit, I think, easy to talk about and hard in some respects, but in our environment right now, I think it takes on a whole interesting dimension because one of the challenge of COVID-19 and the constraints and shelter in home and where physical social connection has been limited, but at the same time, for many, virtual connection has flourished. I think you have to think about how you relate to this. But in general, what the framework for resilience tells us is that you build resilience by building social competence. And what that means is that you have, this responsiveness towards people and engagement. You sort of adapt culturally to different things, and that can take on different meanings for people that are not in their country of origin. That can be difficult. I know I get a lot of questions from people that are international students and trying to adapt to the various scenarios. Trying to learn and think about those aspects can be important. I think empathy is a big consideration. I do feel like right now there's a lot of empathy going around. I also think there's some pockets where maybe it isn't there. I don't want to, speak too much from my own, personal point of view in that regard. But one of the comments I think I'll make about empathy, I'll extrapolate. The person you're dealing with on the other side, there's always something going on. There's likely a scenario that they're facing. They may not be telling you. And I think the piece of empathy to be aware of is that other people might have something going on. So if somebody is sharp, if somebody doesn't get back to you in an email, always ask yourself, gosh, maybe this person is busy, or maybe this person has something, happening. I know right now I'm super behind in many of my tasks and activities and emails because I just have a lot more going on, in my life, trying to deal with my family, helping out my dad. There's just a lot of personal things that I don't like them to interfere professionally, but this is life. And so having that kind of understanding, which, kind of crosses caring as well. Caring kind of moves into this territory of how do you help others? One of the things I think we learn is that we become stronger when we care about others. And that helps us create that life meaning that what I'm doing, I'm not just doing it for myself, I'm doing it for others as well. I had a mentor many years ago who gave me great advice. And this was probably at that point when I was speaking about, trying to prove myself and, prove those accounting firms wrong. And I would prove them wrong by getting the fastest promotion on my team. And one of the mentors I had who maybe thought I was being a little overly aggressive in my ambitions said to me, why don't you just show that you care about the success of others and do work in your teams to support the team, to support the leaders of the team. And if you do that long enough, people will recognize you. You just need to make sure that, your contributions are known. And it changed my paradigm quite a lot. It changed how I was received by people. And it changed my personal relationships. And I think that you end up having a lot more advocates that then help you work through things. So that idea of caring, I think, has many different meanings. And, in this list of social competence, I think probably the most obvious one right now is just communication. And this is the place where there's continuous challenges. People can't meet face to face. We're dealing with a lot of emails and virtual meetings. This is always going on, but it's just stepped up several notches right now. I even find it difficult to communicate with a person who resides in my home. And I say that with the next point, a sense of humor. You know, even this person that you may spend a lot of time with, could be a family member, could be a spouse, a significant other, a sibling, a parent, and we're confined in close quarters, it can be difficult to be on the same page. I mean, I went out to do one quick errand today. I had to run to the post office, and my spouse is asking me if I can go to the grocery store. And I'm like, you're crazy. I have 20 minutes. I don't have time to go to the grocery store. That probably wasn't, the best way for us to communicate the need to go to the grocery store. So, and then you take that into a broader context of people that, you're trying to connect with for networking, maybe trying to talk to employers. And how do you balance the need that you have for action or information with this complexity of what everybody's dealing with? And I think the way that we put our written communication together, I think also our verbal communication and how we talk with people, those things need attention, and sometimes we're sharp. I had a text message exchange with somebody a couple of weeks ago, and I probably should have just picked up the phone, because the message, to be brief, it was sharp, and sharp is not always a good thing. And that's something that, as I said, I fall off the wagon sometimes with some of these skills. It's natural for all of us. So then what do? You pick up a different communication skill. You pick up the phone and you say, man, that email exchange or that text exchange, that didn't go the way I wanted it to. And that's part of social competence. It goes back to empathy and caring about the person and the relationship. And then, as mentioned, the final point here is humor. And humor has been researched for decades. They've connected humor to health and people who are battling illnesses, using a sense of humor to kind of help with recovery and long-term illnesses. I think it's the same for being resilient. The world is crazy, weird things happen, and how do you look at it? Do you look at it as a disappointment, or do you look at it as ridiculous? And, I face this a lot, and I think I'm somewhat fortunate because I have young kids who do and say really silly things. And it's very hard to be serious in an argument with a 7-year-old. But I try to remind myself that this should be how, in general, to not take things so seriously. When things break down, it doesn't do any good to get angry and uptight about it. And there are things that I want to be serious about. But in general, trying to find, what's kind of silly about a situation and deal with it that way. I mean, again, I want to separate things that are super serious and you have to be serious about. But a lot of times, just looking at something and saying, oh my gosh, that's just not worth being so stern, and looking at it from that funny light, it's going to help. It just helps your ability to handle the blows. And I think that's a point that, as I'm walking through this, some of these things come to this behavior that is counter resilient. And one of those behaviors it's called ruminating. And when I say that, some of you may know what this means. Some of you may have this behavior. I have it. It's this idea of when something negative occurs, you swirl it and analyze it and stay on it. And ruminating is the enemy of resilience, because if it goes on, especially for a long period of time, it can snowball. And that snowball builds into negativity. And negativity is not optimism. And it's not sort of having this more hopeful look on things, but it is very natural. And I think ruminating is something, once I had that term and that awareness of my own behavior, and I could time box it, it really changed my outlook. I again still fall into that trap, but I think what helps to not ruminate about things is to look at things with a sense of humor. So I welcome any and all jokes, especially as we're going along in this conversation. So if you guys said this is the worst webinar ever, I would try to go find something funny about that, so I didn't have to ruminate and feel disappointed. So a couple of these last points, and then I'll spend a few minutes defining maybe how you can take some of this. And some of these are actions, so keeping that in mind. This dimension of purpose and beliefs, I tend to think that this might connect with many of you, if not all of you. Most people have goals, whether they're fitness goals, career goals, financial goals. We may or may not be disciplined in how we deal with our goals in terms of writing them down, but a lot of us have our goals. That is why you're probably listening to this conversation. That part of it is fairly straightforward. And then I think the other thing, and this is very prominent these days, education is such a big part of our world and our worldview, that we have these educational aspirations. I know when I teach my class at DePaul, my career management class, I often ask who's thinking about going to graduate school. And these are undergraduate, right? Sophomores, juniors, some seniors. I would say more than half of the class is already thinking about graduate school. So those educational aspirations are important. And even those of us that have a graduate degree, we're often asking ourselves, how can we continue to learn? So this part, I think, is fairly planted. And then, the other parts of this fit into this puzzle: optimism and more or less seeing the glass half full. And you can ask yourself, when you think about scenarios, when you hear news, good or bad, how do you think about that news? Do you look at it with the half full glass or the half empty glass? Optimism tends to work a little bit better for resilience. The cynicism or the, kind of thinking about the negative side of things actually works really well back in problem solving under planning and scenario planning. And then the final part of this kind of purpose and beliefs, and I'll be very broad in this terminology. There's kind of this faith and spiritual connectedness. The purpose is not specific to any one religion, and then there are also people that work outside of organized religion. Faith is a term. It's about belief, and having that belief, I think, is paramount. And sometimes that belief, when it comes to resilience, is belief in yourself and believing that there's something that you're meant to do. Some people go as far as talking about destiny, trying to find that thing that you were meant to do. All of those things make sense. And there's varying degrees of this. I think for me, if we were having a beverage and talking in more of a casual setting, I probably would get into the details a little bit more. But, I do have a belief that there's some purpose of my personal and professional journey. I've had some obstacles. My family was in a car accident when I was a young kid. The fact that any of us survived is, if you want to call it a miracle, I'll call it a miracle. I think a lot about that, and so that has always kept me with like this greater sense of purpose. But I don't think it has to be something that big. But I think knowing that those things that you aspire to, that you feel connected to, and believing in yourself, I think that's a really important part of this. So the last component then of resilience is encapsulating a lot of this, and it's really about you and how you think and how you feel about yourself. And, some of it is this sense of identity. Who are you? What is it that defines you? How do you describe yourself? One part of it is self-efficacy. So, how do you feel that you, through your own actions and efforts, influence the actions or the activities or the outcomes that come your way? Another is self-awareness. Are you realistic about how you are, your skills, your talent, your weaknesses, your, if you want to call them demons? Um, are you open to real feedback? I've had a lot of really tough feedback over the course of my career. I worked for an individual one time. He was not the person who hired me. I sort of, came into his team because he was put into a position when someone moved into another area, and we were oil and water. I mean, it was not a good fit. And at some point, he told me he didn't want me on his team anymore. And so I had to find a new position in the organization. He wasn't willing to fire me, but it was pretty clear. I mean, that's a painful reality. I've had people tell me at times that I look very discouraging when they're speaking about ideas. Like, I have a physical look on my face. And that's hard to hear, but I'm never going to get better at being, a professional, being a leader, being a parent, whatever my roles, being a sibling, being a spouse, unless I'm willing to really dive deep and kind of look at how I'm being. So that's hard stuff, but it really, really does matter. And, I have actually had friends that have told me, you're being super negative, and you've been super negative for a while. And that's why they're my friends, because they know they can say that stuff. And that, we're not going to walk away with a grudge. So that, I mention a lot about those self-awareness things because sometimes we don't even know. And this is where I discovered this idea of ruminating, because I found myself at certain periods in kind of a funk, and that funk then would come out in actions. Maybe I was a bit sharp with people. Maybe I started looking for a job or trying to do something out of frustration. And it was really because I spent too much time ruminating about something negative that had happened. And with a little bit of self-awareness, I can now recognize that and then try to make certain adjustments. So that's key. And then, task mastery and trying to break things down into small chunks to have wins, periodic wins, so that it doesn't feel like it takes so long to celebrate an accomplishment. That's another self-leadership skill. And then the final skill that I'll mention under self-leadership, and this is hard. I don't say this easily, but sometimes you have to remove yourself from negative situations. In the business environment, we call this, toxic workplaces, toxic leaders, managers that you work for. Sometimes it's friends. That's when it's really hard. Um, I I think about this, and one, I think at times maybe I've been that person, and I know, and if I look back and I really apply that self-awareness, I can say, gosh, maybe some people that I had a relationship with sort of socially, that we became distant, maybe it was because they were feeling that I was a bit too cynical or negative. That's one possibility. And I also know for myself that I've perhaps had those kind of people in my world, in my work world, in my personal world, and it it created an environment for that ruminating I was talking about. And that's, something that's super hard to deal with. And I think about it. I think about it even with the team that I have now. I mean, I think I'm very fortunate. I work with some super positive individuals that also have good resilience. I've had a couple of people that have had a bit of that negativity and that didn't work out so well. It's something that we think a lot about when we've done some recent hiring. It's very hard, but it is so important. And so, if you think about a few of these, circumstances that maybe you've been in the past where that water cooler conversation, if it's, so and so did this or the company made this decision and oh my gosh, gossip and kind of getting on that bandwagon, those are also counter resilient behaviors and activities. And I think, what I believe is true, again, because we're human, that's something that we have to do because we need to express our frustration. But it's good to be with people who will just say, well, that's enough about that and let's move on. Is that a situation that we can change? Yes or no? Are we going to speak up about it? Yes or no? And you can decide, but just, maintaining that kind of base level of negativity, it does not help with the resilience skill set. Okay. So these pieces come together and all of them are like cross training. They're different muscles. If you put it in the context of, a sport, you have to build muscles in many different areas to succeed in a sport. If you're a musician, you have to build skills in, different aspects of playing music or performance. So the framework really is about picking apart these pieces, trying to figure out perhaps where you have strengths already, where you have behaviors that you're already engaging in and build on those. And then picking out a few things where maybe you can just add to that muscle group. And, a few tactical next steps for maybe you all to think about, and then I'll spend some time with questions as we have them. So some activities that I think make sense. So one activity is called counterfactual thinking. And the idea is you have something negative that occurs, or you're facing a problem in your situation. And the idea is to really ask two questions when that happens. So question number one is it faces downward. It's like, well, maybe that situation could have been worse. So I had my internship canceled. Well, what could have made that situation worse? Well, maybe I could have moved down there and then the shelter in home, and I had spent all kinds of money and I didn't even get to start my internship. That might have been worse. Or maybe I'd taken that internship and, oh my gosh, maybe the person I'd worked for was a, terrible manager and it just would have caused me a ton of stress. Okay, that would have been worse. That's one side of it. The other side then is, how could this situation turn out better? It's like, well, okay, I've lost my internship. What will make this situation better? Well, maybe I have a chance to take a summer class that I hadn't thought about, and I can get a little ahead of my schedule. Maybe I could I've always wanted to learn how to bake. Maybe I'll start paying attention to baking classes and I'll spend the summer learning how to bake. I mean, that's a very silly example, but the idea with this counterfactual is take a situation, Think about how it could have been worse. And then the second part is, now that that situation has occurred, think about how it could be better. And this is a behavior, this is a practice. So it's called counterfactual thinking. That's one activity that you can engage in. The second activity is called feedback generation. And this really helps with that self-assessment. So this is a great time to maybe do a self-directed 360. Send out a couple of notes. Maybe it's people you've worked with in the past, maybe it's a professor, maybe it's a friend or a peer, and maybe, even do it simple and just say to them, I'm taking this summer and I'm thinking that this is a, professional growth opportunity for me to just tool my skills up a little bit. I have 3 questions for you. What is one thing that I should keep doing that you think I do really well? What is something that I should stop doing because it's a bad behavior or it's not showing me in the best light? And the third thing, might be something that I should do new if I'm trying to enhance my career in a certain area. And this is simple. It can happen over email. If you've got access to a free survey tool at a university, or you can use something like SurveyMonkey, you can do it that way. You can do it anonymously. You can do it open, doesn't matter. But this idea of generating feedback, it helps you maybe see, one, in that self-awareness dimension, and 2, it could help reveal some of the places within the resilience framework where maybe you want to do a little bit more work. So that's an activity that I think is valuable. The third activity is really around expression of gratitude. And this is something that I think is like spreading karma. It also helps with building social connection. And it's maybe just, picking a handful of people that, again, you haven't talked to in a while, or people that have made an impression on you, people people you don't know, and just sending a short note, email, LinkedIn, written, and just say, hey, you're someone, I took your class, it meant a lot to me, I learned a lot, I just wanted to thank you, and have no expectation. I did this not too long ago. There's an executive who runs a company here in Chicago, who's an entrepreneur. His name is Jason Fried. He runs a company called Basecamp. I've admired just the way that he leads. I like his product. I heard him speak at an event a few months back. And one day I just sent him a note and said, I really appreciated your talk. I learned a lot. I've applied some of those things in this way. And thank you. That's all. Sometimes you get a reply, sometimes you don't. But it kind of helps address some of these other, it works some of the muscles in the resilience framework. And it also opens up possibilities just to have some dialogue with people that maybe you haven't talked to, or maybe you want to talk to. So that's one activity on my list. And then my last one is something that I call it a Lighthouse Collage. So it's kind of a fancy term, maybe. If you guys know what a lighthouse is, it sits usually on coastal waters. Back in the day, lighthouses were used by ships to make sure they didn't crash into the rocks. And I use this lighthouse collage to help me focus. So I build it digitally. I'll build it, in something like Photoshop or PowerPoint. I put certain pictures or words. You can do this in a lot of different ways. I mean, you could actually do it on paper. Nothing wrong with the old-fashioned, get a piece of poster board and some, magazines, or print out images. But I'll put pictures of things that represent stuff that's really important to me right now, that helps me focus. and I might put a quotation, something that really resonates with me right now. I might put a lyric from a song. There's a song right now called High Hopes. I play that a lot on my podcast, my iPod list. It could be my goals, could be some memories that serve you well. I mean, it could be anything. And I use this collage. So if you physically make it, it's kind of nice, print it out. If you can do it in color, if you have access to that, great. If not, no big deal. But like I'll print it out and I might put it behind a cabinet, or I might put it, in a place on my desk that's for me to look at when I need to, or I might put it inside of a notebook. And when I'm facing challenges, I look at it to remind me. When I'm facing frustration because maybe things aren't progressing the way that I want them to, I take a look at it. When I have tough decisions and maybe I've got some difficult choices to weigh through, there might be things there that help guide me. And I also I think the creative activities that type of lighthouse collage puts you in, it's distracting. And so when I find myself, especially if I'm into that circumstance where I'm ruminating again, when I can really like sharply adjust my focus to do something very creative, it almost snaps out of that kind of thinking. And I occasionally need some of those jolts. So I like to do things like that, and other things that follow. I mean, if you like drawing or doodling or building things with Legos and all that fun stuff, they all fall into kind of the same category of using more creative tasks to kind of break up the routine. But the Lighthouse collage serves a particular purpose to again remind you, help you focus. And this idea of past, present, and future is something that I try to wrap that collage around, because there are things of the past that remind us. There's the things that we're doing right now that are the in process, and then there's the future. I mean, that's the kind of meaning of life elements. And so that's another way to kind of think about that. And if that's not your sort of forte, those things can also be done just with writing. All right. So I think with those comments, I am happy to take a few questions by the chat. I'm happy to expand on anything. I'm happy to talk about tools, resources, anything that might be helpful just as you all think about your present circumstances, building resilience. I know there were a number of questions submitted, but if we want to talk first, for those of you that are here on the webinar live, any questions that we can talk about, or even comments that you all may have. Comments, questions, thoughts?
Hi, this is Christina Wagner.
Hi, Christina.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks. So the question that I have is, if you have resilience or you work on it, how do you appropriately convey this type of positive, resilient kind of attitude and foresight when you are interviewing and or creating a resume, so that you can put that foot forward without necessarily saying, I'm resilient?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a few things. Let me talk about the interview, and then let me go backwards to the resume. So I think in the interview, this is a place that you can really showcase. So one of the things that employers want are professionals who are resilient, who have persistence, who have grit. And usually it comes about, like, they're trying to figure this out when they ask questions like, tell me about your biggest failure, tell me about challenges that you've overcome, tell me about a time that you had an idea and you couldn't get people to buy into it. What did you do? I mean, there's a number of questions that the underlying skill set that they're trying to get at is just, how do you deal with frustration, and when do you know when to give up versus when do you dig in? So I think that you can do some reflection about all those different project work related challenges and map out how you tackled it. You know, it's essentially like describing the maze that you walked through. So if you think about this, you know, all of us, we face projects, and it's like I'm walking along and then I hit the dead end and I had to turn back, you know, and go the other way. And then I ran into a big mud puddle, you know, and those were like naysayers, or, you know, an executive that maybe I couldn't get their buy-in. And like describing how you dealt with that. So I ran into that wall. I realized that this approach wasn't going to work. So I stepped back. I thought about it. I went and talked to a few people. I got some input. I did a little bit of research, and then I came up with a couple of new approaches, right? So that's how you talk about it in an interview. Some interviewers, because of the culture of the company, they will care about personal challenges. You know, what's the hardest thing you've ever had to do? You know, what's the biggest personal obstacle that you've overcome? And you may be able to say, well, to be honest, this job search, this has been, it's been tough for obvious reasons. But let me tell you how I handled some of this. And that's one of the reasons why I'm super excited to be here today, because I know I've worked really hard to just stay positive, right? So in an interview, you're talking about professional resilience. You may have an opportunity to talk about it on a more personal level. The key in those conversations is to focus more on how you overcame the challenges, as opposed to spending a lot of time giving details about the frustration and the setbacks. Like, that's not what the interviewer wants to hear, because their concern will be that you are someone who ruminates. So you can be, when you're planning for your interview prep, that is how to tackle it. All right. Now, on the resume, it's a little bit trickier, because you tend to be describing, A, very concisely, because the resume needs to be short, and B, you want to put things into more of a positive light. But I will at times use phrases in the resume like overcoming misalignment, dealing with ambiguous priorities. One of my other phrases is, and this probably isn't the right way to say it, but like rescuing a project that had begun to fail. You know, so if you have some of that within your resume bullet sprinkled in, you'll get across, you know, even using words like turnaround, overcoming employee performance issues. So the lesson from some of this, if I link those two things, is you're short on describing the object that you had to be resilient about. and you elaborate more on how you dealt with it, the actions to move forward. Does that give you some direction on that question, Christina?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And I think, you know, it's worth also saying this is a tough area. I've seen even some of the most talented people. It's almost like you get to that interview stage, and it's like the adrenaline combined with the pent up frustration. It's like the dam breaking. And sometimes in the interview setting, a few of those things, they just come out. And this is hard. I mean, this is a really hard behavior to control, especially when you've been at it, you're tired, you've had a lot of setbacks. And the one piece of advice that I can offer when you know, if you find yourself in that circumstance, is to practice putting some of that stuff out of your mind. Like, practice makes perfect. And that's where this continuous, you know, sort of skill set of resilience, it's like every interview is preparing you for the next one. I mean, that's easy for me to say sitting in my chair. But if the interview goes well, awesome. If the interview doesn't go well, it's prepared you for the next one. And ideally you keep learning from that. I mean, of course, it's challenging to say that when the interval between those two interviews might be kind of far. And it's also challenging to say that because there could be nothing that you did wrong in the interview. I mean, I can tell you, I mean, we did an internship interview process. And when it came down to making a choice, because we had, you know, one person, the individuals who did not get the internship, there wasn't anything wrong. And that's terrible to say, but it was more just trying to, again, fit a skill set and background as the puzzle piece into our picture. And our decision was much more around the fit than the performance of the interview, you know. And so, you know, I say that because I think this is one of the sources of frustration when you're interviewing. Is it may not be that you did anything poorly, but you show, in a macro sense, you show your resilience to employers by just saying, you know, I'm excited to be here. And I think that I have a lot that I can offer this organization. And then let me say one more thing, and then I'll stop. I think one of the best ways in the job search you can be resilient is if you are turned down, you know, because likely you're going to get a call or an email, and you say to the employer, you know, I appreciate the opportunity. I hope the candidate you bring in does a great job for your team. I really enjoyed getting to know the organization. And should you find that there's another opportunity that comes up that might fit my background, I would welcome the chance to talk to you again. And I guarantee that if you say something, don't quote that, don't repeat it as a speech, but 99% of people never say that. Because as a job seeker, we feel like when we've said no, it's because the employer is rejecting us. And that isn't always the case. Sometimes there's two exceptional candidates and you can only hire one. And I know many people who have gotten a second call after they got a no. So in the world of, you know, for those of you that are job seekers, if you find yourself on that side of the job search where an employer is telling you no, I would try to just continue to convey their interest. And, you know, you at least give yourself a good chance that maybe when something opens up, or by the way, maybe that candidate that they hired doesn't work out. That also happens. I mean, and I don't, if any of you listening happen to be on the HR side, you probably know that it happens with frequency. And then you might be the person that they call immediately. So, there's a few of those other thoughts I wanted to make sure that I shared. There's a question online on the chat that I want to answer. So, how do we keep from falling back on bad habits after we land back on our feet? So I like that question. So if I sort of think about this, the idea is you guys have something that you're working through, you have a goal you achieve, maybe you're a job searcher, students, and things now move forward and the rainbow appears, and it's easy to kind of go back to the old ways. I guess I would offer a couple of thoughts on that, because I do think that that's really true. Like when times are good, it's easy to not do certain things. One, I think habits are habits. And when we get into habits, and there's a lot of research also on habits, they stick. And so if you form habits, try to make them stick. Habits are not for the good or the bad times. Habits are just habits. So I think there's a bit of a mindset here. The second thing I would encourage is to have a person or two in your world who is a truth speaker. So my spouse is a truth speaker. I mean, we're kind of stuck together, I suppose. At least we have been for 45 days now. But he'll be really honest with me. And I mean, I suppose that's one of the reasons why, we are life partners and together and married and all those great things. Because, love has certain attributes, but you also gotta, feel committed as a team. But on top of that, I have a couple of friends that are people that are really honest. One of my closest friends is she's a big supporter, but she'll also tell me when I'm over my skis or I'm not thinking realistically. I have a business, the co-founder of my company. She is a truth speaker. She's much more like realistic and sees things a very different way than I do. And we have some rules about open and honest conversation. So I think having a couple of people on your team that help you with those habits. And then maybe the third suggestion I'll offer, I think it's worth, once a quarter, once a year, stepping back and find a day to just think a little bit. And probably as professionals and individuals, this is one of the hardest things that I find for any of us, is to step away, turn off the devices, sit someplace and ask yourself some really good check-in questions. How are you doing? Are you aligned? Are you ruminating? Are you feeling good? Do you have people around you that support you? Are things headed in the direction? Are you being your best self? I mean, not to be, too quirky about it, but most of us know when we are being the person that we are, when we don't have to fake it. And I think just stepping away and asking some of those good questions of yourself and doing that quote self-assessment, that self-reflection, being, tough on yourself, but then also spending part of that time acknowledging the accomplishments. That's another thing that I believe many professionals lack, is stepping back and looking at how much has been accomplished. Because especially those of us that are in formal work environments who get performance management can sometimes focus a lot on what we need to do better. And we don't spend as much time on the things that we've done awesome. So I like to self-celebrate and remind myself. And with time, that can be hard to do. So I think a few of those things, they require, for me, what I do is I just put the date on my calendar. I'm really good when things are on my calendar. If they are not on my calendar, it gets tricky. So, and then find what works best for you. All of us are a little bit different. We have different degrees of discipline. But try it. I mean, that's probably the I think the thing I would like to maybe offer as a last comment, and I'm happy to stay on the call kind of beyond the formal wrap up. But the last sort of formal comment I'll make with our time is this. I don't think anything that I've talked about is in the spirit of perfection. It is not possible to be perfect, and I am a perfectionist. I'm really obsessive compulsive about certain things. I like to have things done right. I like to have things go right. It's somehow wired in me, and I have had to allow myself to be imperfect. And so, recently I had a couple of, professional things kind of rattle my world, and I was ruminating. I mean, I couldn't sleep. I would get up at, 2 a.m. and I would read or do some work or, binge watch, some crazy thing on Netflix or Showtime. And I just, like, for several weeks, I was doing this on and off. And I just kind of gave myself a talk. I was like, all right, you're ruminating. You get, 2 or 3 more days and then this has to stop, and I say this just because I do think this isn't perfection. It's knowing, it's trying, it's continually making progress. And, the great thing about resilience is it's always there. And there's not a destination. It's not a place that you're striving to be. It's wherever you are today, getting a little bit better. And if you get a little bit better, tomorrow you'll be better than you were today. And next week you'll be a little bit better. And then if you have a setback, that's okay. You allow it. That's part of being resilient. And then you keep moving forward. All right. So with that, I want to, again, thank you all. A couple things when I post this on the website, at our website, archercareer.com. It'll be under insights with all the other webinars. And I also will be posting a couple of articles, short articles that I think could be interesting to read, a couple of resources, but there don't have to be fancy things, I think, that go into this. I hope that you guys have found this interesting. Thank you all for letting me share a few, of these experiences of my own. I hope that has, connected with you in some way. And everybody have a good rest of the week. Good night.